Now, this is the first day of our new series where we look at the life of David. David, we're talking about that David, the famous David, king of Israel, David from David and Goliath, the one with the sling, wrote a lot of the Psalms, the famous David. Now, if you've been coming around for a while, you know that David's life had some high highs and some low lows. He had high highs where he was the hero, and he had times in his life where he was low, where he was the villain. And as we look at his life, even though he was the big king of Israel, we're going to see that we have some things that we can relate to him, the highs and the lows. Ultimately, we're going to be looking at different parts of David's life over the course of his life, and we're going to unpack his story of this complicated man. The big picture idea that we're going to see throughout the whole time that we're spending with David is that David was a man who accomplished God's purposes. He had high highs, low lows, but he was a man who accomplished God's purposes. So today we're going to start with the first part. We're going to see David at the beginning of his life, David the shepherd. Now, in addition to being a pastor, I am also a registered nurse. And when I was in nursing school, we had to do these rotations where we went around to different parts of the hospital and look at these different specialties. We would look at the operating room, the emergency room, the ICU, the pediatric department. We would spend time in all these different departments to kind of experience it. And one day, I'm in the operating room rotation. It's where you go in and you get to watch some operations. And I'm standing in the hallway. I'm leaning against the wall. I'm kind of just waiting to go in. When all of a sudden, this guy comes up behind me, puts his hand on my shoulder, and he goes, "Hey." I'm like, what the? I turn around, and I see this kind of like middle-aged man, late middle-aged, kind of gruff looking. He's got like a scrubbly beard. His hair is kind of all over the place. He's kind of dressed down, and he's pushing this cart thing. He kind of looked like Steve Buscemi. You guys ever seen that actor? For those of you who don't know who that is, it's the guy from this meme. That's what this guy looks like. And I'm like, a little like, what's this guy's deal? And he says to me, he goes, "Hey, I like your watch." And I'm like, that's a little, like, this is a nice, okay watch. It's not like fancy, but I'm like, what's good? He's like, "You want to trade?" And I was like, all right, this is getting a little weird. I'm a little sketched. Is this guy going to rob me in the hallway of Albany Med? Like, I don't know what's going on. So I'm a little rude to him. And I go, "Hey, thanks, but, I'm good." And I kind of walk away. He shuffles away. So anyway, I go into the operating room, and I'm getting ready to watch the surgery, and the doctor in there is trying to get in an A-line, which is like an IV that goes into your artery. It measures your blood pressure when you're in surgery. What you need to know about it is that it can be a little tricky to get in. It can be kind of hard to get in the right place in some patients. And so this doctor is trying and trying and trying over and over, and he just can't get it in. And this doctor looks totally different. He's like clean cut, nice haircut, in shape. He looks like one of the doctors on Grey's Anatomy. Like he looks like a doctor. And he's got beads of sweat. He's struggling. He can't get it in. And it's a high tense situation. Everyone's watching. It's a room of like 6 people. We're all waiting. The patient's on the table. There's a whole list of people who need their surgery. He's sweating. And finally, he throws up his hands and he goes, "Okay, I can't get it." And he's like, "I got to call the expert in." So he picks up the phone, calls somebody. And so I'm standing there. We're all waiting. And then I look up and I see the janitor comes in. And he walks over to the sink to wash up for surgery, and he takes off his watch, and then I notice that he's wearing a Rolex, and takes it off and sets it down. And the other guy was using all this equipment to try to get in and couldn't do it, but this guy, he walks up, and I'm not joking, closes his eyes, feels the patient's arm, and puts it in and gets it in the first try. And I was like, what is happening? Turns out this guy's like some big, like one of the best surgeons in the area. He flew into town for another case, and he just decided to jump in and help. You can't judge a book by its cover. Sometimes looks can be a little deceiving. Sometimes janitors can be doctors. The interesting thing about that is we can't always judge a book by its cover, but a lot of the times we can. Like, right? We know that. Like, let's just all be honest for a second. Like, most of the time, when you make a first impression, you can judge someone on their appearance, and most of the time you're right. And that's not even necessarily bad. Like, sometimes that's good. If you're walking to your car at night in a dark, parking garage, and you see someone coming towards you, like, you need to know What's going on? Like, it's a very different reaction if it's an 80-year-old woman with a cane walking towards you, or if it's a 6-foot man in a hood with a mask. Like, you need to be able to make a decision. So sometimes judgments are okay. In fact, that's a big part of our culture, is making first impression judgments. Like, I'm not good at cars. When something goes wrong in my car, the most anxious thing about that to me is that I have to go to the mechanic. Because I'm just so, I don't know what's happening in there. I'm not a car guy. I'm like a hold the flashlight kind of guy. But when I go to the mechanic, I'm trying to see, is this somebody I can trust? I need to know, is this somebody who I can trust, or he's going to take advantage of me? Maybe you've been on a dating app before. You're making a first impression literally just on a picture. If you want to be with this person forever or go on a date or whatever, you're making first impressions just on a picture. And some women love it when guys hold fish, and some hate it. There's a lot at stake. In fact, it's pretty interesting. Harvard did a study in 2003 where they found that people who were above average in attraction, they were attractive, more attractive than the average person, were way more likely to be hired and to get promoted. In fact, they found that attractive people made between 10 and 15% more money for the same job. University of Buffalo did another study where they found that if you were taller than average, you were way more likely to be in a position of power, like a CEO or a president. Elsa's like, my chances are over. There's this thing in psychology known as the halo effect, where when we see someone who is physically attractive, we automatically assume that they're going to have other positive characteristics, that they're going to be kind, compassionate, generous, just based off how they look. We're always making judgments about people, and sometimes it's good, but sometimes the janitor is a doctor. So what do we do? How do we make decisions? Because we need to make decisions. Who can we trust? Who do we want to be our friends? Who do we want to date? Who do we want to marry? How do we make decisions in our life? What standards, what are we looking at to decide who to trust? Thankfully, this isn't a problem that just started happening with dating apps. This is something that's been going on a long time. In fact, one of the biggest, best prophets in the Old Testament judged on appearance twice and got it wrong. We're going to take a look at that in this beginning part of David's life. Eventually, we're going to be in 1 Samuel, but we're going to need to get a bit of a running start as we look at the life of David. In the Old Testament, it's a bunch of different books and poetry and types of literature, but it's really telling one story. So if you want to look at the beginning of someone's story, you got to go to the beginning of the story. Oftentimes, that's in Genesis, and that's actually where David's story begins. Is in the book of Genesis. That's the first book of the Bible. And it starts with a promise that God makes to Abraham. God says this to Abraham, one of the founding fathers of the faith. He says, I will make you very fruitful, which means you're going to have a lot of kids. I will make nations of you, and notice this, kings will come from you. So God makes a promise to Abraham that his generations, from his children, his grandchildren, from his lineage, kings are going to come from it. We don't see that for a while, though, because we come to the book of Judges, which tells the story of these judges that ruled over Israel, God's people. They weren't kings and queens. They were people who ruled on God's behalf, because God was the real king of Israel at that time, and the judges kind of enforced God's law. And there were good judges, and there were a lot of bad judges. But what's important to know is this. At that time, the people wanted a king. They didn't want to follow God anymore. They wanted to have their own king. They wanted to make their own rules. They wanted to have their own laws. They didn't want to have to follow God's laws anymore. In fact, it says this in Judges chapter 21. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone just did as they saw fit. Everyone just did whatever they wanted to do, whatever they thought would make them happy, whatever they thought was best. They didn't listen to God's law. They wanted their own king. Then we get to the book of Ruth. Ruth tells a love story between a woman named Ruth and a man named Boaz. They fall in love. God brings them together through crazy circumstance. They fall in love. They have a child. We get to see Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi. Her faith is amazing. It's incredible. And it goes through this long story, and it's this really sweet ending. But at the very end, we notice something incredible. The book of Ruth ends, and it hints to us that whole thing was about something a little bit bigger than just a love story between two people. This is what it says at the end of the book of Ruth. Then Naomi, that's the mother-in-law, took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son. It's a happy ending. And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So in this book about a love story between these two people, we're starting to see the first time we see David's name mentioned, David. Why are we pointing to David? What's so important here? It's important to know who the great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather of Ruth was. Abraham. Abraham, through his lineage, was Ruth, and it looked like it might have ended with Ruth. But God did something where he brought together Ruth and Boaz, and they had a child. What we need to know here is God is reminding us, he's saying, hey, I haven't forgotten my promise to Abraham, that from Abraham's line are going to come kings. I haven't forgotten. You haven't seen them yet, but I'm still at work here. So keep in mind, we've got this tension. There's these kings that are become from Abraham, and we've also got these people that want a king, but they don't want God's king. They want their own king. So we've got these two competing forces happening, and then we finally come to the book of 1 Samuel, and that's where we're going to read about David. God raises up a prophet named Samuel, which is a person who speaks on God's behalf to his people. Samuel's a pretty notable prophet, and he meets this man named Saul that God sends to him because God decides, I'm going to give the Israelites what they're asking for. I'm going to give them a king, and I'm going to send Saul. So Samuel sees Saul, and this is how Saul is described. Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. The Old Testament doesn't typically say things like that. They said he was a stud. He was tall, he was strong, he was handsome, he looked like a king. And so when Samuel sees Saul, he goes, this is the king we've been waiting for. Finally, this is the guy. He looks the part. He's tall, he's strong, he's handsome. He looks like a king. And everyone is so happy. The Israelites are rejoicing. They say, finally, we don't have to listen to God anymore. Finally, we've got our own king. And at first, it seems like it's going well. He rescues the Israelite people. He wins a battle. But it doesn't take long for things start to crumble in. Because Saul looked good on the outside, but on the inside he was missing something. Because when things got tough, when things looked scary, he crumbled. And he lost his faith in God. He turned away from him. He looked like a king, but he wasn't able to perform like a king. So, God decides, I'm done with Saul. The Israelites have gotten their king, but this time I'm going to give a king, and this type of king is going to be a little different. This is Samuel speaking to Saul. He says, now your kingdom will not endure, Saul. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of his people because you have not kept the Lord's command. Pay close attention to this phrase. A man after his own heart. That's the key to understanding what we're going to talk about today and this entire story of David's life. What separates Saul and this man, we're going to see it's David, is that David is a man after God's own heart. That's what's going to be the difference maker. So God tells Samuel, go to Bethlehem, the king that is after my own heart. He's going to be there, and he's going to be one of the sons of Jesse. So Samuel goes to the town, he shows up. It's a big deal when Samuel comes to town. He was very famous, he spoke for God, and the people were terrified when he showed up to their town. They're like, are you going to bring judgment on us? Like, they're so scared. All of the elders come out. He goes, no, I'm just here to perform a ritual. I'd like all of the elders to come, and I would like Jesse and his sons to be there. So he gathers together the sons of Jesse in this festival, and he starts looking at the sons, trying to figure out which one of these sons is going to be the new king. It says, when they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands here before the Lord. So Samuel sees Jesse's oldest son, and he goes, this is the guy. He's here. There was no question in Samuel's mind. We even know that when a king dies, it's the oldest son who becomes the king. There was no question that it was going to be the oldest son of Jesse who was going to be king. But notice what happens. The Lord said to Samuel, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things that people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. He says, be very careful, Samuel. Don't make the same mistake that you did with Saul. Eliab looked like a king. He was probably tall, handsome. He looked the part. He was the oldest son. He had a good resume. He looked like he was a good option. But God says, I see the inside of him, and I know that that's not my guy. That's not him. He looks the part, but he's missing something important. God says, I don't see people the way that you see people, because I can see them on the inside. And so Jesse brings out his other sons. Son number 2, and God says no. Son number 3, God says no. 4, 5, 6, 7. God rejects all of the sons of Jesse. He says none of them are qualified to be the next king. And I love this little piece. Samuel shows the faith that he has. He doesn't go, God, you've made a mistake. This is all the sons. He goes to Jesse. He goes, Jesse, where is this all of the sons? Are these all of the guys that you have? Are these all of your sons? And Jesse goes, there's one more. But he's not here. He's actually out back with the sheep. Can I tell you, please don't miss how incredible this is. All of the build-up to the next king of God's chosen people, back in Genesis, through Judges, into Ruth, God is working all these incredible things together to keep his promise to Abraham, provide for people a good king after his own heart, all this anticipation, all this build-up for hundreds of years, generations upon generations, and the guy's not even at the party. He's not even invited to the party. David's status was so low that he didn't even count as one of Jesse's sons. He was son number 8. Think about that. That's like if the president came into town, invited your family, and your entire family went, but your parents told you, yeah, you got to stay home and do some chores. Or maybe like the president's not good enough. Taylor Swift comes into town and invites you to dinner, and they say, actually, you got to stay back. You got to do some chores. That's like the real-life Cinderella. Like, he has to stay home and do chores, and the stepsisters get to go to the ball. Can you picture David out in that field? What that must have felt like. This is the biggest event that is going to touch his village, his little town, for like his entire life. The prophet Samuel's in town, and his family's been invited, and he's got to go hang out with the sheep, which is like the lowest job. He must have been hurt. Have you been hurt before? Have you ever had friends that hung out without you? Have you ever had, like, your parents not respect you or not value you enough? Do you ever feel like you've been overlooked before? Maybe your boss doesn't respect you or appreciate you. David knows how that feels. And he's out in the field with the sheep. It's hot, dusty, dirty work. The party started, and he looks and he sees something incredible. He notices somebody coming running towards him. And running towards him is a messenger that gets to him, and they say, David, Samuel has asked for you by name. He wants you there, and he's not going to let anybody sit down until we get there. Imagine David's reaction. He was probably shocked, scared. Imagine him standing before the door before he walks into this room where everybody's at. The mayor, the governor, his entire family, this guy who speaks for God is in the room. They're dressed in their best clothes to meet with Samuel, and David is in his workout clothes. He's dirty. He's gross. He walks into the room. Imagine how people looked at him when he came out of the room. Everybody turns and looks at him. His brothers are looking at him. They're not happy. They've all been rejected and embarrassed. And now son number 8 is coming in here. Look at how David is described when he comes in. He was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. And the Lord said, "Rise and anoint him. This is the one." David looked like a king. He still looked like a king. Saul looked like a king. His oldest brother looked like a king. And now David looks like a king. How are we supposed to know who's a good king? David didn't look any different. He didn't have the resume, but he looked the same. They all looked good. What separated David from everybody else? And it's back to that key phrase that he was a man after God's own heart. Maybe you've heard that before, but what does it really mean? You know, I was sharing with a friend of mine that we were as a church, we were going to be going through the life of David. I said, "Hey, we're going to be going through David next." And she goes, "Oh." I'm like, "Okay, what's wrong with that? You don't like David?" And she goes, "No, I don't like David. I don't like him. You read his story, and he does a lot of bad things. He's not a nice guy." And I'm like, "It's true." And she's like, "But I know that I have to like David because he's a man after God's own heart, so I guess I have to get over it." And we can feel that tension. Like in this part of the story, David is the underdog, but that's not always going to be the case. It's going to be hard to read. We're going to read about David, and he's not going to sound like a really nice guy. There's going to be things that are hard. And so we need to understand what God is saying when he says he's a man after my own heart. The good thing is that we don't have to wonder. We don't have to guess, because Paul in the New Testament tells us what it means. When the New Testament talks about the Old Testament, we never have to guess what it means. That's God telling us what it means. And here's what it says in Acts chapter 13. This is Paul speaking. "And when he had removed him, when God removed Saul, he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, 'I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart.'" What does it mean? "Who will do all my will." Who will do all my will. It doesn't say he's a nice guy, and what it means is he will do all my will. That doesn't mean he's going to do everything that I want him to do. And the key to understanding this is in the word will, because it's actually deeper than that. That word can also be translated as purpose. He will do all my purposes. He will accomplish all of my purposes. The life of David and the high highs and the low lows he experiences can give us some takeaways. Sometimes the message of David's life is to be like David. When his life lines up with what God's purposes are, when his life is in line with what God wants him to do, the lesson is, yes, let's be like David. But when his life and his purposes don't align up with God, it's don't be like David. The highs, when he's the hero, is when David's life is aligned with the purpose and the mission of God. And when he's the villain is when he's not lined up. He does his own thing. But here's the bigger takeaway picture, is that throughout the highs and throughout the lows of David's life, God is in control. The highs and the lows, David's life is characterized by God using him, good and bad, to still accomplish his purposes. The ultimate purpose of David's life wasn't just the highs and the lows that we get to read about. His great-great-great-great-great-great-grandson is going to be a man named Jesus. The ultimate purpose of David's life is to bring about a better king. Now, we're not kings. Our great-great-great-great-grandchildren aren't going to be Jesus. But can't we relate? to God working the highs in our life and the lows in our life for His good? When our lives line up with what God wants us to do, then we can be blessed and we can be a blessing to others. And when our life isn't lined up with what God wants us to do, we feel that. And we're not helpful to other people. And here's the beautiful thing, guys. It's not a mystery about what God wants us to do. He tells us very directly through Jesus. Our job is to love God, love people, and serve others. And when we're doing that with our life, we can rest assured that we're accomplishing God's purposes. So maybe you're here tonight and you feel overlooked. You don't feel appreciated. You feel insignificant. Maybe you feel like no one cares. Be encouraged by David that God sees you. He sees your heart. He knows if you're living a life that is in line with Him. Maybe you're here tonight and your life isn't lining up. My warning to you is the same. God sees your heart. It doesn't matter if you try to look like you're living a good life or you look like you're being a good person. God knows what's going on here. It's not about coming to church or trying really hard or doing good things. God says, I know what's going on in your heart. And the first step to lining up your life is to trust in Jesus, the better king. David had high highs and low lows, but Jesus was the perfect king. That's the first step to bringing your life in line with God. How do we know who to hire, who to fire, who to marry, who to break up with? It's so much bigger than just finding a nice person, somebody who just does good things. Be on the lookout for someone whose life lines up, whose mission in life is in line with what God's mission is, that we love Him, we're loving people, and we're serving others. None of us will do that perfectly, but God is so good that we don't have to. You guys pray with me.